I'd like to call this special meeting of the Great Island Advisory Committee to order at 7:01 on Wednesday, April 9th. And thanks everybody for joining. Kip is not, I don't think is going to be able to join us tonight, but otherwise we have everybody. So before I get into the agenda, I want to highlight something I think is really important that's happening townwide. And the Planning and Zoning Commission is updating the Darien's Plan of Conservation and Development, or the POCD, as a lot of people call it. And this is a guiding document for Darien that helps shape decisions about land use, preservation, and development in town. And it gets updated once every 10 years. So the 2016 POCD played a direct role in laying the groundwork for the purchase of Great Island. So this update, this every 10-year update, this update has long-term impact on projects and priorities that really matter to our town. So as part of that, the P&Z is running a townwide survey to hear from residents. And this is our chance to weigh in on what's working well for Darien, what we value, and what concerns we have for the future. This is a survey. They're doing one survey. It closes on April 18th, which is, I think, a week from Friday. So I hope that everybody will fill it out, take the time to fill it out. It doesn't take that long. And you can find it at darienpocd.com. A couple of other items for your calendar, if you have it out. Becca will talk about it, but Saturday, May 17th will be our fourth and final community engagement for the master plan. On Monday, May 20th at 7 o'clock at the Darien Library, the library and the Museum of Darien are hosting George Knight for a public talk on the history and design of Great Island buildings. And it's a great opportunity to hear more of his perspective as part of this master plan. So on Monday, a couple of days ago, the Board of Selectmen made a recommendation to the RTM to establish a fine of $100 for off-leash dogs on town-owned property. And I believe they will have it on the April 21st agenda. Does that sound right, Mark?
Yes, it is on the agenda. Yes.
It is. Okay. So thank you, all of you, for giving your feedback on this. The last item for dogs in the near term will be to determine which areas, such as the beach or picnic areas, that should be dog-free. And we should have all of this information finalized by June 1st when these new rules take effect. Lastly, our next GAC meeting will be a Zoom only on May 7th. And it's really hard to land on a date that works for everybody, right? So for instance, tonight, Lori has a Park and Rec meeting at 7:30, so she will be leaving for that. And actually, John will be joining us, but then he will be leaving to go to that meeting as well. So for the May 7th meeting, I'm going to circle back up on this at the end of the meeting, but will you consider yourselves, I will take a poll at the end, if the May 7th Zoom only could be done at 6 or 6:30 so that we can keep some of our people that have to leave for other meetings at that meeting.
So Monica, is there no April 23rd meeting?
Yes, there is. I'm sorry. I'm just adding this to your calendar. There's a regular, the fourth Wednesday every month is a regular meeting. Okay. And it's in person, and sometimes we add the Zoom feature.
Okay, so this is an addition. Okay.
This is not on the calendar. Linda will put it on the calendar, but it's not on the calendar, but it's May 7th. Okay, so it's a Wednesday. Okay, with that, next item is public comment. If you would like to give public comment, if you could raise your hand, you're going to go down to that little heart reactions and raise your hand, and we will, Meg will help you unmute. Anybody for public comment? Raising your hand? Nope. Okay. Next item is a presentation from Reed Hildebrand, and we're going to hear from Reed, and then we'll hear from Jay. Okay. Thanks, Becca.
Thanks, Monica. Good to see everyone this evening. Very happy to be with you all tonight. I'm very excited to have a chance for James Lima and Carrie and Yishan to share the thinking that they've been developing for Darien around how to think a little bit more carefully about governance and financing options. So that's the bulk of what we'll talk about today. But just to sort of familiarize everyone with where we are before we get into that conversation, I would love to talk a little bit about the calendar. And so here is our very familiar schedule preview. At the moment, right, we're in the coming toward the end of the first part of April. And this is a month where we're really doing a lot of due diligence to think about, given the sort of array of possibilities and the more specific priorities that the community has brought forward in the different kinds of conversations and outreach sessions we've had. How do we think about the real fit and the sort of importance and development of those, and in what order, and what will all those things look like? So we're doing a lot of work sort of behind the scenes to refine the possible planning futures for the island right now. The next thing that we will share with you, if you go back one, Mike, is a sort of consolidation of those options, and we'll have a conversation at the end of this month looking at the kinds of choices that are ahead for the community, but a much narrower array of possibilities than we've been sharing in the past, given some of the clarity that's come forward. So we do, just to reinforce what Monica is saying, we're really excited to have people come and join for that May 17th meeting. And we are in the process of coming up with some fun ideas for the experiential engagement that will follow that. We go to the next slide. And so just briefly, we're going to touch on these updates. You can go to the next slide. Thanks, Mike. So this is a sort of simple, almost bubble diagram looking at the island and where we have called out different project areas that we're going to be developing basically specific improvements for. And in a very simple way, I think most of these areas are familiar with, to everybody on the committee, but also to the people who are joining in digitally tonight. And the idea is that there will be discrete projects that we can focus on within each of these areas. There are a set of improvements that are island-wide that are necessary to bring the island up to code and to make it sort of safe and enjoyable and maintainable, basically operable for the community. We go to the next slide. We've talked before that there will be some sort of early wins or early access improvements. They'll be pretty small in nature compared to the larger plan. And we've been looking more closely and trying to understand on the ground, and then by having conversations with the different kind of regulatory authorities about how to convert the root cellar into bathrooms. And we're studying how many stalls and what percentage and what the doors, and how to make sure that the architectural legacy of the root cellar and the greenhouse are protected by those improvements for adding bathrooms there. And then these are two older studies that we have shared with you before about possible vehicular and parking solutions. And we're looking very closely right now, it's not represented here, but at an idea similar to the strategy to one-way loop, but potentially actually entering on the southern causeway, which I know is an idea that people have asked us to look at that is looking quite promising as a solution. And as part of that, we're also looking at if we can fit a little bit of parking, probably some level of pervious parking in that flat area beside the boathouse that would be off of that lower loop. So all of those studies are happening, and there are a lot of conversations that are going into this to make sure that those solutions are viable. But I think we're really excited about these projects for early access. Go to the next slide. So we just wanted to share that the kind of master plan and concept plan that we're developing right now will be a holistic vision for the future of the island and for the town. But within that, there will be not just these specific project areas, but there will be a phasing strategy. And the first phase of these larger projects is actually within the way the plan has been developed. It's called phase 3. So phase 3, which is at the title here, really represents the first set of implementable projects on the island. And the way we're trying to think about this is that there is a set of things that really must happen for the island to be converted from its residential sort of domestic family use to a public open space. And a lot of those improvements have to do with infrastructure and access, making sure that things are up to code and very safe, that there are, American Disability ADA provisions so that it is a place for everyone, no matter what their mobility or other issues might be. Part of what you have to operate a functional open space is a place to wash your hands, to have a drink of water, to use the restroom, and then also some benches, place to sit, a little bit of shelter to keep out of the cold or really difficult weather situations. Additionally, for this property, because there's such extraordinary architecture and historic fabric, we need to stabilize and make sure that we're caring for all those wonderful structures. And so there is an investment in a number of those structures to keep them from further falling apart or degrading. And then basically there are a set of utility improvements, things related to like sewer and water, electric, those sets of improvements. Some of the stormwater management conditions on the island really do need help. A priority that's come forward as we've been looking at the ecology on the island is invasive management. And I think one of the really happy findings, right, that we've had is actually how healthy a lot of the vegetation on the island is. But there are several areas where we're going to need to really take charge of the invasives and slowly convince them that they don't want to be on the island. And then I think the last part of these early required projects is there are a set of conditions that aren't safe, and it doesn't make sense to continue to maintain. And so there'll be some demolition as part of these sort of early projects to make the island safe and operable for the community. And I think we're looking, I should share, because I think it's really helpful for the conversation tonight. We're trying to understand that kind of costs as like, what's the minimum set of costs to bring the island into the kind of functional open space that it wants to be. And it's not entirely clear because we're still early in that process, but it's sort of tens of millions of dollars to address this checklist. And we're looking to try to be very careful and selective about where money goes. We don't want to diminish the quality of the experience on the island or make it feel like it's changed too much, but there are a set of investments there. We go to the next slide. We've also identified in conversation with you all and the community a set of priority projects. And I think these are the kinds of projects that are going to make people really feel incredibly excited about Great Island as a place to be. And so some of those priority projects are this idea that there's a coastal trail and potentially some boardwalks to take you around the island, that there is a place to spend time at the stables, probably some improvement of the wings and the forecourt, so that there's some real enjoyment and occupation and use of the stables building and its court. The carriage house, we've talked a lot about how that actually is a building because of its proportions. It can be an amazing place for small events. And it really requires some immediate improvements to not start falling apart at a very rapid rate. So we're thinking of that as both an interpretation, an interpretation space, a place with some bathrooms, and a place for the community to come together. A space that we had mentioned in the last meeting is really how fantastic the pink house or the playhouse is. And it does appear that it's a very modest amount of investment that is required there to make that a really usable environment or building for the community. So that's been identified as a priority project, high return, low investment, not a lot of change required there. Additionally, while the boathouse itself is quite a challenging project, we are excited that we're learning as we're looking more at the feasibility there, that there is a future project that seems we believe is going to be able to make the boathouse occupiable and really usable for the community, but it's going to require some investment. So in the meantime, though, that space outside of the boathouse off of Ziegler's is just such a beautiful place to be that we're imagining that for pretty low investment, we could make a great outdoor terrace for people to spend time and picnic and enjoy that area. And then the last thing is there's been an enormous amount of interest in having some space for play and a place for kind of families to really feel like it's just an amazing island to take your children and spend an afternoon. And so to make a space that is really dedicated for families and doesn't necessarily need to be a full building, but a very light, sort of joyous structure that is potentially also maybe a little bit art inspired. There has been a lot of interest in the idea of having sculpture and art on the island. And so that this seems like an area where we can maybe bring that forward or pilot it. So if we go to the next slide, I think we're aware as we've been looking at costs that there's sort of priority projects do still bring some pretty steep costs, and we're not, it's not clear, but it's probably another 20 or even $30 million to start to make those improvements. There are, in addition to that, some recommended projects related to the idea of really being able to have some level of coastal facility by the beach to make the upgrades around the beach that are needed to make it safe. Everybody's aware of that old sort of jetty that was part of the ocean pool, but is really not a safe condition right now. At the stables and connecting to the pool field, there's potentially a very glamorous set of projects and improvements that are a little bit more large scale that would prepare the spaces to be able to host public events and much larger, both inside and outside, town scaled sort of events. So more like 200 or 300 people occasionally. We don't see that happening super frequently, but to be able to take advantage of the scale of these spaces and bring them up to sort of performance standards for larger groups of people. Additionally, we've heard a lot of excitement about being able to have sort of lookout spaces along the coast that actually take you out above the water. So we are including those on the recommended project list. And then lastly, and I think kind of with celebration, the idea that there is a set of improvements that we could make at the estate house that would start to allow that to be a place for celebrations and a kind of routine occupiable space. So not any kind of full renovation of the estate house itself, but potentially there is a little portion of the building that could be renovated to become usable, and that there are exterior improvements or improvements like an outdoor tent space that could be made there so that can be used and enjoyed by the community. But all of these projects will be priced and will have supplemental costs, and we'll be going through the process of trying to evaluate how feasible it is to pursue any of these recommendations with you in the coming months. And with that, I think, if you go to the next slide, maybe there's some comment or questions, or we can get right into the conversation with James Luna and team and come back to some of those sort of organization of possible projects later. Monica, maybe I'll leave
Becca,
it
what
to you.
is
No, sorry, Jeff, you go.
what is still being examined on the two road alternatives?
What is still being examined? So thanks for that question, Jeff. I think you're aware you saw us out there on Friday, and we were actually out there again yesterday. We're trying to make sure, our hope is that for early access, we're able to be as minimally, have as few impacts on the island as possible and still make it really safe. So what we've been trying to understand is and I know there's been lots of conversation around this, but what are the turning radiuses that are required? What are the sight lines? Where are there tree roots that we need to protect or avoid? What is the actual extent of pavement? Where are there elevation conditions where we can get ADA compliant parking in? Where do we need to pave for the roads, and where can we get actual parking spaces? And based on all of those criteria, which of the two options that we're looking at really ultimately makes more sense? So I think there's very strong reasons to consider a one-way loop and very strong reasons to consider trying to go with a northern causeway, which is, I think, more aligned with the long-term vision. But we want to be, we're trying to finalize all this due diligence and have several more engineering conversations. And then we'll have more conversations with Public Works and with the fire marshal, and just ensure that have real consensus about which is the best solution to go forward with. So I think we should have a more clear position about all of this before our next meeting, Jeff.
Becca, I think that we should continue, and then just because some people have to leave, and I know they'll want to hear this next part, and if people want to talk more after that, we'll come back to this. Does that sound good?
Yeah, I think it's great.
Okay.
Great. Thanks, Becca. Every time I hear you talk about this, I get excited. Hi, everyone. Good evening. I'm James Lima, head of James Lima Planning and Development. I'm joined by my colleagues, Yushan Law and Carrie Dunphy. We're going to talk about various case studies that provide some way forward about options for successful models that balance the level of responsibility and risk that are involved in deploying capital projects and taking on the roles and responsibilities of operations and management and programming. So first we'll maybe ask a few critical questions to frame the role of town governance and some of the financing options. Next slide, please. And so first on capital projects, who takes the lead in moving those forward? It's an enormous undertaking, right? All the components, as you know, of managing capital projects. Where does that funding come from? Is it one source or numerous layers? There are a number of ways to do this. And how does the governance structure around those capital project management and funding streams for them affect the quality and the standards of capital project delivery for you? On the operations and programming side, again, who takes the lead? There are many models there, and there's no one right way to do that. And where does that funding come from? This is often, again, multi-layers of public-private philanthropic dollars. And then how does that governance structure and funding stream shape and create value for the public, really aligned with your own vision of the future of Great Island? Next. So we'll look at a few examples, a number of them quite local, and a few in the region that I am sure you're familiar with. So Carrie Dunphy will go through case studies for Todd's Point, for Wiveni Park, for Central Park, Mill River Park, and Brooklyn Bridge Park.
Great. Thanks, James, and thanks, Becca. I know there's a lot of text and information on each of these slides that we can refer back to, but we really wanted to provide a lot of information on the slides, and I'll speak to the high-level points of each one. So starting in Todd's Point, Todd's Point was previously a privately owned space that was acquired in 1945 by Greenwich. And throughout the 60s, 70s, 80s, we can move to the next slide. Throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s, the improvements were funded and made by the town, but there were historic structures on site that were deteriorating. So a town-led group in the early 2000s formed a conservancy specifically to infuse capital into these deteriorating historic structures to bring them back into productive reuse. So while the town continues to manage capital projects on the park itself, the Conservancy is focused on just the buildings and raising funding for that, including being able to get a Connecticut Urban Action Grant to turn one of the buildings into a rec center. On the next slide, talking about the operations and programming, the majority of the operations are town funded and managed through Greenwich Parks and Rec. But there is a small volunteer run friends group that does some sustainability programming, runs some cleanup days, and really just does some extra support for the town. So we're starting off with this example as an example of lower intensity managed open space, where even though the town primarily takes a large role in the capital operations and programming, it is really helpful to have stewards that can provide programming above and beyond what Parks and Rec can provide, and to do high value activation of historic structures. So in this case, the town was unwilling, or for other reasons, unable to take care of these structures. So really needed a steward to come in and fill that gap. So moving on to our next example. So in Waveney Park, so this was also previously a private estate. The next slide. So this is an interesting example where actually the town is in charge of capital improvements to the large historic house, whereas the Conservancy, the Waveney Park Conservancy that operates there, contributes and manages some capital projects. So the town is completely in control of the house. There's a staff member from the town that manages the house, manages events. The Parks and Rec department is actually housed there. It's where their offices are. And then the Conservancy does some capital improvements on the grounds, although those are, of course, completely approved by the town itself. Next slide. And so for operations and programming, these responsibilities are also split. So the Parks and Rec handles all of the daily operations, while the Conservancy, with their very small staff, manages some specialized care above and beyond what the town is able to provide. The town also manages the programming. So again, all of the programming in the house, as I mentioned, and all of the programming on the grounds as well. So this is an example where the town is really taking that lead role in the capital operations and programming, yet it is slightly less complex than Great Island with just the one house. And the approvals and the process of getting capital from town funding for improvements to the house actually do take a while. So the decision-making process can be pretty lengthy, which could be ameliorated by having a dedicated steward for that house. Moving on to a much more complex, much larger park in Central Park. We have an extremely well-researched Conservancy that manages essentially all capital projects, yet of course with approval of the city. In none of the examples that we see does a Conservancy, a dedicated steward, a nonprofit organization make all of the decisions. The owner of the land, which is in all of the examples we look at, which is the town or a city, always has final approval for any large capital projects. In this case, the Central Park Conservancy manages all capital projects and does the majority of the fundraising and funding of these projects. Yet the city will match funds for those capital improvements where needed. So this really allows the Conservancy to, their dedicated focus on this really enables very high quality restorations with specialized expertise that generally exceeds the city capacity and also bypasses that kind of lengthier decision-making process that it would happen if it were just approved if it was just managed and approved by the city. So what's also interesting by Central Park, even though we know it's a larger and more complex park, of course, is that what's interesting here is that they also have an endowment that was given by a very generous donor. And they pull from that endowment for both capital projects and for operations. And we can move to the next slide. And so we really want to talk about how this is also an example of how there's an opportunity for Great Island to think about advocating for and leveraging an endowment for both capital projects and operations. And that can be used year over year. But what we also wanted to highlight, even with the Central Park Conservancy, which is a huge organization, the city still does take a big role. They do still provide funding for operations. About 10 to 15% of the budget comes from the city. And they do retain control over park policies, large events, permits, and concession agreements. So while the Central Park Conservancy is in charge of operating and maintaining the buildings within Central Park, the city is the one that actually manages those permits, those concession agreements. So the city does retain still a lot of control over the park, even though the Central Park Conservancy plays the lead role in funding the capital improvements and ongoing operations and programming.
I'll just note we're working for a park steward in the Midwest right now, and one of the opportunities there is that a locally based but national pharmaceutical company that has a major endowment is desperate to find things to fund because it's making so much money from weight loss drugs that it can't hold on to all of the stock value that it has. So it may actually endow a fund for this park we're working on. So there are opportunities to look at philanthropy to achieve these goals.
Yeah, exactly. And endowments are great because you can think of a initial donation as something to be put just into one project, or converting it into an endowment makes the funding last longer and be able to be pulled from year over year and really fund a long-term steward of an open space. Moving toward and in exchange for example, for the donor who gave the gift that became the endowment, in exchange, they were given a seat on their board. And in all of these parks that we're looking at for the boards of the organization, the city always retains, the city or a town always retains a position on the board with varying levels of decision-making authority. For the next one, so moving back closer to home, so Mill River Park in Stamford. So this is a much more recent park. It's only, even though the designs were from many decades ago, they really have only put it in place in the last 20 years. And the Stamford recognized that they needed to close the gap between the city funding and construction capacity that they had and the project costs. So the city created the Mill River Park Collaborative in the early 2000s to have a public-private partnership that could help close that gap and expedite the construction of the park. So for this park, this being a totally new park, there was a lot of upfront capital expenses, and they really were able to get these from a diversity of funding sources. This also has included some sources that wouldn't be applicable here, such as a tax increment financing district, which would require real estate development around the park. but they also did a lot of philanthropy, fundraising, were able to collect some grants to make the park a reality for the very high upfront costs of creating a new park. However, of course, everything while the collaborative handles all aspects of capital design and delivery, the city has to approve any new projects that happen on site. And so this is really an example of where the city is involved, yet the collaborative really takes on the majority of the work, which really reduces the strain on city resources to create very new assets. Next slide. And even though, and it's a new park, and so it's a new collaborative, while the collaborative manages all of the operations and programming, the city of Stamford does provide an annual grant for operations. This has been different year over year. So it's really dependent on what their needs are. And because it's a new park, it still is pretty high at over $650,000 a year. Though I would assume that over time, as the park is able to generate more revenue, that is potentially something that's renegotiated year over year. And then the diversity of operating funding streams that they get really does create a return on public investment and creates this great publicly accessible park with a collaborative that is able to operate relatively independent from the city, reducing a lot of that strain on city services. And then our last example is Brooklyn Bridge Park. And we've designed these sort of in level of complexity. Brooklyn Bridge Park, in one sense, is the most complex, but it's also the cleanest. So this is a park that was originally owned by the Port Authority, and so the state and the city, recognizing that they didn't have the capacity or funding to transform it themselves, created the Brooklyn Bridge Park Development Corporation in the early 2000s to steward the park's development. And of course, the corporation has to get approval for large projects, yet it has to support them without additional funding from the city. So this is the example where the corporation is really independent and must fundraise and get all of their funding completely separate from the city. However, what is a little unique here is that the majority of the funding that the corporation gets comes from pilots, so payments in lieu of taxes, ground leases, and other real estate assets that surround the park. And so they're able to be separate from the city, but it does mean that there is a lot of private sector involvement and investment in the park. Next slide.
I would just say this started out as a largely state and city funded park improvement project. And over time, through bruising battles and many debates, there was a level of commercialization, if you will. So upland areas were made available for ground leases up for real estate development, for a hotel, for condominium, and some office space and retail. But these were existing buildings that were at the edge of the park in most cases, and there was some limited amount of ground up new development. But it was a negotiation over time between the friends of groups and the stewards, the development corporation.
Yes, thanks. And so all operations and management of the park since the initial capital improvements have been 100% financially independent from the city, again, post-construction. However, again, so 90% of the operational funding does come from those ground leases, the pilots, concessions, et cetera. And it is a very well-resourced organization with 40 to 50 staff members. And as James was mentioning, this originally started as actually two organizations that just in the last few months have merged. So there was a Conservancy and the corporation, and they've recently decided to merge into one organization, which is now the Brooklyn Bridge Park Corporation. So again, the government retains control over, they appoint people to the board and still retain the land ownership, land ownership over the lease development parcels as well. Yet the corporation is able to exercise a little bit more, they're more nimble, and working in partnership with the city, they're able to make decisions on a quicker basis because of their separation from the city.
So hopefully this is providing a range of scenarios at different scales, different locations, and different levels of delegating control, offsetting risk, and sharing of responsibility and of capability. And also, you can see from a number of these examples that over time they've matured, they've changed, they've adapted. And so it's just interesting that you'll do your best to get the structure as close to right up front as possible, but also know that it can adapt over time as you find and test scenarios and see what really works for you. But you're unique as a really highly capable client group that is already doing things at a very high level of skill and complexity. And so it's really a question of how much control you want to maintain and how much of a parallel related entity you want to invest in, that becomes a kind of a trusted representative of the residents' interests. Maybe we'll stop there.
So any questions or comments?
I have a question. It's Mark. In the Brooklyn Bridge Park Corporation example, the city retains the ability to place members on the board. Was that all the board members or a certain number of the board members? Curious.
You, Sean, might know that best. I'm not sure.
We'll double check, but we do believe it's, if not all, the majority, the vast majority, because the nonprofit was created by government. So it's not like a organic, as we call, private group. It is a government affiliated group. And initially, it was also split between governor and mayor appointments. I think over time, it also went through some changes, but always government dominated.
Got it. Thank you.
And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the city, a couple of different public officials nominate all the board members. So some of the board members are public sector officials, but the board is completely appointed by public officials.
Thank you. I asked that in contrast with one or two of the earlier examples where I think I heard a portion, 10 or a portion of the board was appointed by the city or the town.
Mm-hmm.
I can't remember which one it was. It might have been Greenwich.
That's right. So yeah, so that's a big piece of starting an organization, is deciding the board structure, who will get to appoint who has power. If someone provides a big donation, do they get a seat on the board? For example, the Central Park Conservancy, their board is 55, can be up to 55 members, which is an enormous board. But there's also a lot of different interests to cover on that board.
And in Central Park Conservancy, the mayor of the city does have appointment power, but only for 5 members of the 50-person board. So
right.
A really different scenario there.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Yeah, James, you gave us a lot to think about, and I understand the thought process that, we can always grow into some of this. So, but I think that we need some help figuring out what we need to do initially, right? And it's things like the difference between park and rec and public works, running the day-to-day operations, things like that. So I see the bigger, if there was ever something done with the main house, for instance, and we're in a public-private, I don't think that's going to happen for a while, but we still have governance questions that we need to have answered pretty soon. So what's the next step for that?
I want to answer this question without sounding completely self-serving. Often a government entity will retain or hire owners reps to act, say, in the first year to help gear up and be an extension of your capacity to enlist organizations to help program and activate, or to think about critical capital project management, or to present a concession or long-term lease opportunity to the private market and run an RFP process for that. So there doesn't need to be an entity set up right away. I think the thing we were talking about in our last conversation was the need to have a place for charitable contributions to land that really work for donors. And so, at least creating a 501c3 entity, or having an existing 501c3 that's willing to be your fiscal agent for an interim period of time. We're helping stand up a new not-for-profit on the east end of Long Island. And there's an existing not-for-profit that's willing to be the fiscal agent in the interim to sort of incubate this group over this first year. And in that case, we'll staff the initiative to get it off the ground and to help with fundraising and the like. But it's giving the group time to sort out exactly what the structure of the entity is. I think we'll do a little bit more work, of course, on what your options are. I think the thing that we didn't get into tonight that will be a really important corollary to this is what are the fundraising and revenue implications of different options, and how is it most useful to you? And that's, again, that'll be an iterative conversation about how much revenue you want to raise and feel you need to raise.
I think it might be interesting to hear if you think about the more modest option, right? The most modest options that you shared this evening, and you think about sort of the lean nature of the government in Darien. I think it is interesting that there doesn't seem to be a kind of parallel open space that doesn't have some level of support entity that helps the town government with oversight and fundraising of this kind of place. But I think in a way that feels very consistent with the culture of Darien, the idea that we would be really careful and maybe sparing in how we think about this, particularly initially. I think it'd be interesting to hear a little bit more about, given what you shared, what that very, very lean or skinny option might look like, both from a what would the town need to do, and I think some sense of a building committee might be part of it. Maybe there's a building committee and some other entity that helps fundraise. But it does seem like that in almost every instance there is some level of a complementary entity that helps towns take care of a place like this.
Yeah, I mean, thanks for the question. I think one of the things that's worth kind of reflecting on about this particular place is it's an incredible historic and therefore kind of complicated place, a park of sorts, a beautiful kind of shared open space. And it has, to be crass, real estate opportunities in it that are opportunities to generate revenue that become structural sources of operating revenue to do the things you want to do. And so, and it's a place that you want to have sort of a kind of a unified experience of place at. And so it requires a set of skills that really go beyond what any parks director, any public works person, any, kind of selectman is set up to do, even as a group. So it does require a particular expertise and kind of a niche point of view working with you all. It does suggest that there's somebody who's really just thinking about like the experience of this place and how do I get up every day thinking about the quality and character of that experience, the way that the tenancies are additive to that collective experience, but also they're revenue generators, and I need to tend to those and invest in those and keep, kind of refreshing those. And then I'm tending to a whole bunch of people who are involved in programming and all the logistics of that. And so it's a very kind of intensive mashing up of complicated, dynamic things that really says you all have day jobs and you have, in addition to day jobs, you have your volunteer life. And so it does, I think, make pretty clear that you need some dedicated expertise and setting that up in a way that where procurement is easier and maybe kind of outside the typical government structure is often seen as very valuable. And then the ability to, again, to grow over time as the demands of the place change and increase. But I do think something relatively small that starts with like a dedicated person or two that starts to have that mindset and has, good technical skills, but also the skills of somebody who's kind of running a special event with a real sensitivity to historic preservation. I feel like that was the job that got handed to me at Governor's Island. It's like they handed me keys to the ferry and said, go find a ferry crew to run in New York Harbor. But it was first and foremost a park for the people and had lots of complicated historic buildings that, we were doing our best to figure out how to fill up.
So James, in that example, and I think I'm following what you're describing, was there a document, a scope of something that spelled out at least a rough framework of what this person would be doing day to day, as well as sort of the vision and the broader aspects of, as you said, the niche activities, alongside what presumably the town or the city is providing on an ongoing basis, operations wise. I'm thinking right now, the town's providing a lot of operational support, but over time, as other ideas are developed and perhaps pursued, there might be other support for those items. But in the interim, or maybe enduring, I'm thinking of the Waveney example and the Greenwich example here. There's ongoing support, operational and to a certain extent, some discretion on capital, ongoing. So I'm just trying to picture how that starts to form in its infancy. As you said, it's a mix mash of ideas and concepts, and some we haven't even thought of yet. You got to start someplace, because it could be hard to organize set up something without a structure and some sort of scope. That's right. I could see that being a real tough thing to swallow.
Well, in a way, the Reed Hildebrand report is going to be an enormous resource that I know I didn't have when I showed up doing this job. And in my case, I was tasked with writing the job description and then, help negotiate from the federal government to New York, this military base, and then ended up being the person that got tapped to take the position. So I wrote my job description, but we didn't have this blueprint. I would say you're not going to have any trouble attracting a really talented person to lead an incredibly exciting project with this kind of leadership team, supporting it. One, two, I think they're going to focus pretty early on horizontal improvements, right? The critical infrastructure, getting that right and dealing with access, egress, parking, permits. So the unsexy things that really create the baseline, I think that's a really important early phase of it, but also starting to test the waters for what funders are interested in doing, and just continuing to keep people excited about the vision for what it will be.
Thank you.
Any thoughts from any of the other committee members?
Clearly, we weren't talking about money tonight. Otherwise, there would have been a lot of questions.
James, did you, Longshore and Westport, did you look at that and not use that as a case study for a particular reason? Or Carrie?
I did look at that. I can add it in if that would be helpful. Yeah, that's an interesting one because it's a ground lease to concessions, and we were looking at larger parks, but yeah, that's a good point. We can look into that. And actually, I do have the ground lease itself, so we can use that as a resource.
Any other thoughts from anybody? Okay. All right, you gave us a lot to think about, and appreciate the presentation. And I'm sure we'll be hearing from you again soon.
Yes, good. It's all going to be great.
All of it.
Thank you for the time.
Okay. All right, committee. Any thoughts? Does anybody want to go back to Becca's presentation and ask any questions on that? Share any thoughts? Nope. All right. Okay, this is a very informative meeting, and I think everybody has a lot to think about. So last thing to think about is I'm going to circle back to the meeting on May 7th, the Zoom only, and could I have a show of hands of who would be open to having the meeting start at 6 o'clock?
I'm available on the 7th, Monica, at 6 o'clock. Could work. Later is better for me.
Okay. Is 6:30 okay for everybody? Mike?
I'll do the best I can to make that work.
Okay. All right. We're going to go with 6:30. Okay. Reed, your team can do 6:30, right? Okay. All right. Special meeting. Nothing else on the agenda. So if nobody else has any other comments, I will adjourn the meeting. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all.
Wait, everybody, hold on. May I have a motion to adjourn? Mike moves. Second? Mark seconds. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Meeting is adjourned.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.